So what I wanted to do today is really talk about modern slavery, what it is, the prevalence of it globally, the prevalence of it in the UK, the causes of it, and just sketch out the legal framework and how in the UK at least we deal with trafficking and slavery. And I think it's through the individuals that we can really understand how the system works or doesn't work, as I often see. So, it's important to have this storytelling, whether it's fiction based on the reality or the reality. In a sense, it doesn't matter because it's through that we can understand the human condition in the UK. So first of all, what is modern slavery? I mean, the word slave is a very loaded term. Actually, it'd be interesting to find out how many of you studied the Atlantic slave trade when you were at school, if you were at school in this country. Did anybody study the Atlantic slave trade? Okay, that's interesting. So that's actually quite indicative of overall our collective lack of knowledge about the negative aspects of empire. I went to 5 different schools and I spent 3 years studying history at university, and I was never told anything about the slave trade at all. Empire, yes, the aftermath, the decolonisation, the good bits, if you like, but nobody talked about the slave trade at all. So I don't really like the term modern slavery, because it suggests that it's something which has just sort of emerged now, whereas the reality is that there has been a continuum of slavery and exploitation the world over since the medieval period and even before. But the term modern slavery is an umbrella term, and it includes human trafficking, it includes forced labour and servitude. And the term human trafficking, which is one that we hear a lot about, and there's legislation in place as well as for slavery. It's really got 3 elements. So it's a movement of people. It doesn't have to be across an international border. It doesn't even have to be a very big movement. It could just be a taking of somebody, taking them into your house, taking them into somewhere where they're not free, and coupled with some kind of force or coercion or duress. So that's the means by which the recruitment or the movement takes place. And then there's a purpose. So the aim is to exploit somebody. And it's those 3 elements which you need to show in order to meet the definition of human trafficking. So if I think about the examples from my cases in the last, say, 5 years when I've been working in this area, which has now finally been recognised by the domestic legal system, they involve young Vietnamese boys who are trafficked from Vietnam to the UK to work in cannabis farms or cannabis houses. Could be just an ordinary terraced house that happens to be using rather a lot of electricity to grow cannabis. In fact, there was a cannabis house found about 3 or 4 years ago in Axminster, not very far from the police station, which had been operating seemingly very successfully for a number of years. It includes clients who've come from Europe, come from the EU, who've been trafficked into forced prostitution. It will include clients who've been kept as sort of house slaves. I had a Nigerian client who was sold by his Nigerian parents to a Nigerian couple in the UK, and he didn't see the light of day for 10 years. He was kept inside their house as a houseboy in the middle of Hackney, in the middle of one of the most populous parts of London. So that's going on here as well. It includes people who are sort of start off maybe being recruited as a domestic servant, but then that leads into them not being paid properly or at all, to them being abused and exploited, and there is no easy way for them out. So how prevalent is it? and how representative, for example, are my cases that I'm telling you about? How widespread is it? So we don't really know. Is the answer? We have no idea, globally or domestically, how many people are in fact in some form of slavery or servitude. The international figures are estimated to be about 40 million people. And of those, over half of that, so about 25 million, are people who are in forced labour situations. 70% are women and children. So that's the international side. The UK figures are interesting because the Home Office, about 2 or 3 years ago, the Home Office accepted that we have about between 10,000 and 13,000 people who are modern slaves or victims of trafficking. But that was based upon people that they knew about, and it was based upon people that had actually been able to get into the government system of identifying them. And this is a really hidden crime, first of all, and it's also, even those who come to light aren't always referred into the government mechanism. So that figure of 10 to 13,000 is absolutely an underestimate. There are quite a lot of people, even taking the 100,000 figure. And we also know that it's generating an enormous amount of wealth. I mean, this is why people are doing this, right? I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. And in fact, if you take forced prostitution, you've got a labour source which you can use again and again and again. It keeps making these traffickers money. So there are estimates of $150 billion worth of money being made from this. But there's also a real cost to all countries of human trafficking and slavery. You have to protect and support the individuals. You've got tax evasion going on. You've got huge criminality and corruption. So the cost to the UK is enormous as well. And I think it's interesting that we have this sort of a direct paradox at the moment in the UK. You have, on the one hand, a very hostile environment immigration policy and a Home Secretary who seems intent on trying to deport people as fast as possible out of the country. And yet at the same time, you have the same government saying that they want to do the right thing by, modern slavery. They want to, get rid of modern slavery. They want to prosecute people who are the criminals, and they want to protect the survivors. So you have these two. They're incompatible, I would say. You cannot deal with modern slavery if you're going to have a hostile environment immigration policy, because you risk deporting the very people who are survivors and victims. And I see that time and time again. I get called up and I've got a client who's in a detention centre right by Heathrow Airport with removal directions, for 24 hours hence. And we have to get to an injunction before the court to stop them being put on a flight. And then you start unraveling the story, because at that point, nobody generally has taken any proper statement from this individual. They haven't investigated their circumstances. And it only becomes clear once somebody spends some time with that individual and allows them to tell the story, makes them feel comfortable, that in fact they are a survivor of trafficking. And far from being deported, they need to be, first of all, interviewed by the police properly, so the police can investigate the crime to see whether they can actually prosecute somebody, and they need to be protected. Obviously you can't do that if you're deporting people. So what about the nationalities that are being trafficked and into this country, or the people who are modern slaves in this country? So the government collects statistics, and we can see from those statistics that the top three nationalities are Vietnamese, Albanian, and British. And the latter one really surprises people, and it should surprise and shock us. I think that there are so many British nationals who are victims of trafficking and slavery. If we're looking again in the southwest and what types of trafficking we have here, it's actually quite representative again of the types of trafficking you'd find all over the UK. So we know that there are people working in nail bars, for example, who've been trafficked to this country, people who are working in cannabis farms, people who are working in car washes, People working in agriculture, in large agricultural firms, have been identified here as victims of trafficking, forced prostitution, and domestic servitude. So, when you live somewhere, and I'm local, I live just down the road in Chute. When you live in a place like this, as anywhere, these are hidden people by and large. You don't notice them walking around. One sees beautiful fields, one sees a buzzing town like Bridport, but you don't see, on the whole, victims of slavery. So, what are the causes of this, and how does it relate, if at all, to the historic forms of slavery? Well, in terms of the history, there is I think a real lack of understanding and research about what happened after abolition, what happened in terms of filling the gaps, in terms of labour and fueling this economy, which was geared up to producing cotton, producing sugar, producing large amounts of relatively cheap goods. And the use of indentured labour was incredibly widespread after the abolition of trafficking, and of course never stopped. I mean, there are huge amounts of indentured labour which have always fueled the economy in Asia. But it's also connected to globalisation, it's connected to neoliberal policies and the desire to have masses of cheap food, masses of cheap consumables. So there's never been a period when we have been free of trafficking and slavery. It's always gone on. And the causes, why do people fall victim to it? Well, in a way, the best way of understanding that is through the stories of individuals and through taking detailed accounts. The statistics can't tell us why people have fallen into it, really. You don't drill down deeply enough. So, when I work with my clients and I get the whole narrative of their life story, it's complex, always. And there's usually more than one factor, nearly always, more than one factor of vulnerability which has driven them into the situation where they've fallen prey to traffickers. But it's all about vulnerability. It could be economic vulnerability, it could be mental health, it could be physical health vulnerability, it could be something that's, they could have been suffering a bereavement, they could have become homelessness. It's connected, of course, to war, to conflict, but also to natural disasters, to being prone to flooding, having your immediate environment uninhabitable, forcing you to move. Maybe you've lost your job. So all of this, I think, leads to the collective is vulnerability. And when you've got more than one vulnerability, then you'll have people who will fall into trafficking. Thank you, all of you. You've been an amazing